The first 4 seasons of Game of Thrones may collectively be considered a masterpiece of the medieval fantasy genre. What makes the show work in its early seasons is firstly the subtlety and wit of its dialogue, and secondly the fact that its writing cultivates a natural empathy for almost every single character, thus shading them grey, with only the barest few enjoying no redeeming qualities. This is largely achieved by shackling virtually every protagonist with a hardship central to their identity, which governs their outlook and drives their character development. Jon Snow is a bastard, Tyrion Lannister is a dwarf, Bran Stark is a paraplegic, Lord Varys is a low-born eunuch, Jorah Mormont is a social pariah in his native Westeros. Sam Tarly is overweight and uncoordinated in a world of handsome, dashing knights, and even seemingly stalwart and true heroes like Ned and Robb Stark suffer fatally from being honourable men in a dishonourable world. Yet despite its richly textured storytelling, even in its early seasons, Game of Thrones was subject to a considerable and justifiable backlash from fans and critics alike, who questioned the show's at times deeply exploitative portrayal of its female characters. Men needlessly have business meetings in the company of naked cooing prostitutes. Women converse about mundane matters in an equally needless state of undress. Men provide sexposition about themselves, telling their life stories to ostentatiously naked women, usually Ros, and even female characters in loving romantic relationships get aggressively objectified in a way their male counterparts rarely do. More questionably still, minor female characters are used as naked props in nefarious male schemes. Gorgeous prostitutes are shown being trained in how to please a man. The brothel experience is portrayed as a porn-style fantasy, entirely lacking the grime, disease, or emotional distress that would have been the reality. And on various occasions, a naked woman is arbitrarily inserted into a scene for no reason whatsoever. Most troublingly of all, nudity and or rape are adopted as a form of punishment/public humiliation for female characters. Jaime might lose a hand, but he gets to keep his clothes on, which is more than you can say for Cersei. And whilst Theon gets saved from his sexual assault, Septa Unnella's is treated through the camera's lens as veritably being her just desserts. What makes all of this nudity and sexual violence so problematic is the fact that time and time again the camera participates in the objectification and abuse of its female characters, whilst glamorising the availability of beautiful naked women whose only desire is to provide men with pleasure. And all of this, it should be noted, is quite apart from characters' regular, casual discussion of rape, which serves to normalise it as just an everyday part of life, whilst trivialising the truly horrific nature of the act.
Oscar, who came back for her when the mob had her on her back, they would have taken her every which way and left her there with her throat cut open.
Cersei, I want her. And if we don't drown at the bottom of Blackwater Bay, I will fuck this blonde queen and I'll fuck her well.
We're not attacking King's Landing so that you can rape the Queen.
I'm not going to rape her, I'm going to fuck her.
I'll take the big bitch first. When she's good and wet, you lot can finish her off.
If the city falls, these fine women should be in for a bit of a rape.
Yet, despite its often grossly enthusiastic embrace of its patriarchal setting, Game of Thrones nonetheless succeeded in crafting, on the one hand, an assortment of noble women aspiring to lead in a world where women are meant to follow, and, on the other, a coterie of warrior women aspiring to fight in a world where women wait patiently in a locked room with hearts in their mouths for battle to be over. So how was this achieved? To provide an answer, we need to look firstly at what went right, at how Game of Thrones cultivated so many brilliantly written female characters, before looking at what went wrong, as the show jumped the shark and these female characters devolved into painfully superficial archetypes. Just as most of Game of Thrones' male protagonists are provided with a specific hardship central to their personal identity and character growth, every female character, regardless of their age, class, martial talent, or personal behaviour, is ultimately constrained by their gender, living as they are in a patriarchal medieval world tailored to suit the whims of powerful men. At the same time, however, the show's creators, and the original novels upon which the series was based, actively strove to subvert the expectations of the medieval fantasy genre, not for its own sake, but rather to transform a series of cliché fantasy protagonists into nuanced real-life people, unprotected by plot armour, whose actions, for better or worse, always have real-life consequences. What Game of Thrones does with its female protagonists, in similar vein, is to craft a collection of characters who superficially resemble the well-worn archetypes of traditional Hollywood storytelling: the supportive mother homemaker, the indomitable matriarch, the sympathetic prostitute, the femme fatale, the villainess, the ingenue, and the tomboyish warrior woman, only to provide them with sufficient richness and depth of character that they call into question the very archetypes upon which they are ostensibly based. In terms of character motivation, the series' female protagonists essentially fall into three broad categories. 1. Those who, out of preference or necessity, bow to patriarchal expectation, and are often forced to use their physical attributes to get ahead in life. 2. Those who, beneath a submissive facade, seek to circumvent patriarchal constraint. And 3. Those who openly seek to challenge the existing social order. Every low-born protagonist, by virtue of their disempowerment at the bottom of the social hierarchy, cannot help but end up in the first of these three categories, forced to attach themselves to powerful, high-born men and women in order to acquire a measure of safety and stability. This doesn't mean that these characters aren't without their strengths. Gilly and Missandei, for example, are participants in two of the cutest ships of the entire show, respectively with Sam Tarly and Grey Worm, whilst the series does an especially impressive job of taking Roz and transforming her from a naked source of sexposition into a tragically multi-layered character in her own right, trying to make the best of the cards life has dealt her. The problem is that all these low-born characters are so socially constricted in what they can do that they lack almost any level of personal agency. Shae provides a classic case in point. Despite her relationship with Tyrion being one of the biggest ships on the show, she is in a lot of ways a deeply frustrating character. In the books, she is quite simply a seductress, pretending to love Tyrion because it's to her advantage. The show's decision to have the two of them actually be in love is a wonderfully progressive step up for her character, since the beautiful woman cynically and selfishly sleeping her way to the top is an incredibly tired cliché. Yet, in Shae's first episode, the groundwork is laid during their drinking game that she may have a mysterious past, with strong hints that she's actually highborn. Sadly, this potential plotline is entirely dropped, with the result that as the seasons progress, Shae is granted virtually no character development, nor any personality traits beyond being jealously in love with Tyrion and a devoted big sister type to Sansa. And this is quite apart from the fact that her betrayal, in the books, makes perfect sense, whilst in the show it feels like a sudden volte-face and very forced. Of the show's highborn leading ladies, meanwhile, only Daenerys, supported by dragons and a large army, is in a position to overturn the power structures and gender dynamics of Westeros and Essos, whilst at the opposite extreme, only Catelyn Stark enthusiastically embraces medieval expectations of what her role as the lady of a great noble house should be. Catelyn married a great northern lord whom she hardly knew, moved to faraway Winterfell and provided him with 5 northern children whom she will do anything to protect. She is courageous, independent-minded, and more than a little hot-headed, but in terms of the society in which she lives, she also bows to patriarchal constraint without a second thought. She is unafraid to disagree with Ned and take a contrary position, but she always accepts the fact that as the patriarch, he gets the final word in all family matters. She runs Winterfell much as the well-to-do housewife of 100 years ago ran her suburban home with the help of butlers and maids. She accepts the perils of the birthing bed and the expectations of motherhood as a woman's natural duty. One can imagine her telling Arya precisely what Aemma Targaryen tells Rhaenyra at the start of House of the Dragon. And by her own admission, she does not sit on her son Robb's war council, and although she advises him in private, she never intrudes directly into the masculine business of warfare unless invited to voice an opinion. Indeed, even in her most badass moments, she is essentially following the unofficial rulebook of how a traditional medieval noblewoman exerts power. She brilliantly utilises the feudal ties of the society in which she lives to call upon the loyalty of her father's bannermen to help her apprehend Tyrion. She courageously stares down Lord Karstark, daring him to strike her, partly because she is safe in the knowledge that any bannerman who strikes the wife or mother of his liege lord will be in a world of trouble. And when Brienne pledges loyalty to her, it is made abundantly clear that as a high-born lady, Catelyn knows precisely what her role in the feudal contract entails and takes it with the utmost seriousness. She is, in short, a flawed yet fascinatingly complex character, but she also entirely accepts the patriarchal world in which she lives as the natural order of things. By contrast, most of the series' other highborn protagonists actively seek to subvert the expectations Catelyn so fully embraces. Marjorie Tyrell wears her demure persona like a veil, adopting it as camouflage to mask her razor-sharp intelligence, in the process enabling her to exercise power behind the scenes through her trio of pliable husbands. In so doing, she has been well taught by her grandmother Olenna, one of the great minds of the Seven Kingdoms, who masks her position as one of the realm's few major political players by adopting the guise of an irrelevant old woman, dining in the palace gardens, surrounded by a bevy of flighty handmaidens. Meanwhile, Sansa Stark, whilst held captive in King's Landing, matures and hardens in the face of each indignity foisted upon her, gradually learning the art of the politic from a position of extreme disadvantage. And even Cersei Lannister, a woman of incredible wickedness, smug, spiteful and self-righteous in the extreme, is provided with a nuanced backstory and a series of harrowing personal experiences which serve to cultivate a momentary sense of empathy for her, casting her as a tragically unlikable figure rather than as a straightforward villainess awaiting her justifiable punishment. Of course, given Game of Thrones' patriarchal climate, those who most explicitly refuse to succumb to the gender roles expected of them are the series' coterie of warrior women. Most are essentially minor supporting characters, like Khasi the Wildling, stereotypical villainesses like the Waif and Ramsay Bolton's psychotic girlfriend Miranda, or, like Osha and Mira Reed, likeable warriors who exist solely to protect protagonists more central to the plot. And then, of course, you get the occasional gem, like Bella Ramsey's turn as young Lyanna Mormont, ruler of Bear Island. Unequivocally, though, Game of Thrones' 5 principal warrior women are Arya Stark, Brienne of Tarth, Ygritte the Wildling, Yara Greyjoy, and the dragon-riding Daenerys, each of whom have their martial talents fully integrated into their respective plots and personalities, making them uniquely interesting characters with their own stories to tell. Brienne, perhaps more than any other Game of Thrones character, overtly defies the gender constraints of medieval Westeros, overcoming the initial reservations of her father and a lifetime of ridicule over her size, shape, and noticeably masculine appearance, to prove herself one of the greatest fighters in the Seven Kingdoms. Crucially, Brienne possesses not just the fighting ability, but also the ethos of a true knight, her skill with the blade matched by a profound sense of honour and duty. On the one hand, her lack of guile all too often causes her to make the honourable choice instead of the smart one. Yet, at the same time, her forthrightness and integrity makes her complicated relationship with Jaime Lannister all the more fascinating, evolving as it does from animosity to begrudging mutual respect, to friendship, to a romantic attraction. Yet, when all is said and done, Brienne is ultimately a woman of uncomplicated desires in a world of incredible complexity. She even says so herself.
The good lords are dead and the rest are monsters. All I ever wanted was to fight for a lord I believed in.
And so she does, first for Renly Baratheon, then Catelyn Stark, and finally Sansa Stark. Arya, meanwhile, when the tale begins, is essentially portrayed as the Brienne of her generation. Her initial character arc over Game of Thrones' first 8 episodes traces her indignation and misery at being forced to conform to societal expectations of appropriate gender roles.
Can I be Lord of a Holdfast?
You will marry a High Lord and rule this castle. And your sons shall be knights and princes and lords.
No, that's not me.
What prevents Arya from straightforwardly becoming her generation's Brienne, essentially facing the same dilemma of wanting to be a knight instead of a lady, is the destruction of her house in a series of swift blows, setting her adrift on her own adventure, over the course of which 4 mysterious and eccentric older men, Syrio Forel, Yoren, Jaqen H'ghar, and the Hound, collectively reshape her thinking on the meaning of life, and even more so on her relationship with death, as both an abstract concept and a terminal reality. As Arya goes on the run, thrust into a world of poverty and servitude, her kind nature wrestles constantly with her blackening heart as she loses one family member after another at the hands of the Lannisters and their allies, becoming ever more obsessed with the line between life and death, and increasingly focused upon somehow, one day, exacting vengeance upon her family's killers, never forgetting nor forgiving as she constructs a growing mental list of every person she intends to kill. And it is here, at her lowest ebb, believing her entire family dead and motivated purely by the thought of revenge, that Arya crosses the narrow sea to learn the deadly art of assassination. Indeed, providing perhaps the clearest indication of how far she ultimately strays from her Brienne-like path of early Season 1, when Brienne finally gets the chance to avenge the death of Renly Baratheon by executing his brother Stannis for the crime, she performs the deed formally, as an act of justice. When Arya, a few episodes later, murders Lord Frey, the killer of her mother and brother, and poisons his entire family over dinner, hers is exclusively an act of personal vengeance, devoid of honour or justice, performed by underhanded means, and undertaken solely for her own hard-hearted gratification. At the opposite extreme to Brienne and Arya, Season 2 introduced the wildling girl Ygritte, Jon Snow's love interest, who reveals what life is like for young women living beyond the Seven Kingdoms, free from its feudal hierarchy and prescriptive gender roles. Wildling women, if so inclined, are trained to fight alongside their menfolk, and Ygritte capably wields axe and spear, whilst proving herself a master archer. She is first introduced when Jon takes her prisoner after a skirmish beyond the wall, and, having lost his way, ends up dragging her along with him as he searches for his brethren. Jon has only ever heard about the wildlings from a southern perspective, believing them to be nothing more than bloodthirsty savages. Soon enough, Ygritte broadens his outlook, revealing that the wildlings in fact consider themselves the free folk, exultant at being unbound by the feudalism that governs everyone's lives within the Seven Kingdoms. Ygritte, though, whilst rejecting the constraints of Westerosi society, is by no means a woman without honour. She saves Jon's life in recompense for him having spared hers, before luring him into breaking his vow of celibacy, taking his virginity in a hot spring cave. Yet, for all this, Ygritte is neither a femme fatale, seducing Jon away from the path of honour, nor a bland love interest, and her perspective on their relationship is provided as much as his.
Do you think I'm as dumb as all those girls in silk dresses you knew growing up? You're loyal. And you're brave. You didn't stop being a crow the day you walked into Mance Rayder's tent. The Night's Watch don't care if you live or die. Mance Rayder don't care if I live or die. We're just soldiers in their armies, and there's plenty more to carry on if we go down. It's you and me that matters to me and you. Don't ever betray me.
Yet, in the tragic denouement to their relationship, when John, notwithstanding his aching heart, inevitably betrays her, Ygritte, even with longbow drawn and John at her mercy, cannot bring herself to kill him. And indeed, her hesitation ultimately proves fatal, as she takes an arrow in the back whilst weighing the scales of her broken heart. Yara Greyjoy, meanwhile, occupies a sort of middle ground between Arya and Brienne's strictly gender-defined upbringing and Ygritte's wholesale freedom beyond the Wall. The family tragedy that befell Yara after her father's futile rebellion ultimately proved the making of her as a warrior, so much so that by the time her younger brother Theon belatedly returns home, she has become her father's favoured heir, her credentials summed up by Balon himself.
This isn't Winterfell, boy. Your sister took over command of your eldest brother's ship after your new father killed him. She's commanded men. She's killed men. And she knows who she is.
Balon's estimation of his daughter's abilities proves entirely justified. When Theon disobeys orders and captures Winterfell, Yara rides in not with reinforcements, but to derisively scold him for his short-sighted strategy. All the while, the strict obedience she commands from her crew stands in deliberate contrast to Theon's comrades, who hold him in barely concealed contempt. Yet, for all her bravado, Yara, unlike Balon, truly loves Theon, despite all his faults, with the result that after he's been captured and mutilated by Ramsay Bolton, she reveals her true colours as a great wartime leader, defying her father with a firebrand speech and setting off to rescue him. The only other female character comparable to Yara Greyjoy as a wartime leader is the true heiress to the Iron Throne, the exiled Daenerys Targaryen. Daenerys was first introduced as a battered adolescent, married off against her will to the Dothraki warlord Khal Drogo. Thrust into a completely foreign environment, Daenerys is treated by her new husband as little more than a source of sexual release, to be used at his pleasure, whose sole purpose is to bear him children. Yet, ever so gradually, as she accustoms herself to Dothraki customs and culture, Daenerys comes to realise that the key to escaping Drogo's oppressive hold over her is not to resist him, but to win his heart. She gently cajoles him into making love consensually, in more intimate positions than he's ever tried before. She learns to speak his native tongue so they can properly communicate. And she begins to genuinely play the role of Khaleesi, standing up to her cruel brother Viserys and commanding her Dothraki followers with a newfound self-confidence. To this point in the story, Daenerys has entirely fitted the model of a well-written princess character in a traditional medieval tale, working within the gender constraints of the society in which she lives to secure her autonomy from male oppression and forge her own destiny. As Season 1 concludes, however, 3 interconnected events reshape her goals and set her on a path towards an even higher destiny. Firstly, Drogo dies suddenly from an infected wound, forcing her to strike out on her own. Secondly, she confirms her earlier suspicions that she is the last true Targaryen dragon, physically immune to fire. And thirdly, in a game-changing moment, her 3 stone dragon eggs hatch, making her the mother of dragons, and, in the longer term, arming her with a fire-breathing aerial assault weapon unseen in generations. Thereafter, through all her subsequent highs and lows, Daenerys determines to introduce a new and more benevolent world order, in her own words, breaking the wheel of the society in which she lives. She begins on Essos, freeing an army of unsullied slave soldiers and convincing them to fight for her of their own accord, before moving from one large city to the next, destroying their millennia-old culture of institutionalized slavery and earning the new moniker Breaker of Chains. Finally, with a Westerosi alliance at her back, she crosses the narrow sea with an armada ready to retake the Iron Throne. Game of Thrones has justifiably been lauded for producing some of the best written female characters ever brought to television, who lived fully in the shades of grey between being straightforward good or bad women, and who cleverly subverted many of the long-standing tropes that have blighted the portrayal of female characters since the earliest days of cinema. These plaudits, however, come with one important caveat. Once the series ran out of books to adapt, and once the overall quality of its dialogue and storytelling deteriorated, almost every single Game of Thrones character was gradually denuded of the subtlety and sophistication that had made them so engaging, and instead devolved into the very archetypes they had previously subverted. So, against this backdrop, let's now turn to consider how the show, in its later seasons, completely dropped the ball on its female characters. The first inkling of Game of Thrones' decline appeared with the entirely mishandled Dawn plot, which provided a masterclass in how not to write female characters. Fans of the series were entirely won over in Season 4 by the performance of Pedro Pascal as the Dornish prince Oberyn Martell, a suave, cavalier playboy, intelligent, urbane, cultured, well-travelled, and openly bisexual, and also one of the deadliest warriors in all the Seven Kingdoms, who dies in a trial by combat attempting to avenge the rape and murder of his sister at Lannister hands. The ensuing Dawn plot in the books centres upon the efforts of Oberyn's elder brother Doran, the ruler of Dorne, to maintain an amicable facade with the Lannisters as he secretly works to bring them down, all whilst dealing with Oberyn's bereaved paramour, Ilaria Sand, and bastard daughters, collectively known as the Sand Snakes, each of whom are as charismatic and martially talented as their father, enjoys significant political support in their own right, and seek immediate vengeance for Oberyn's death. When adapted to the screen, however, events in Dawn were never permitted to flourish as a subplot in their own right. Instead, Doran was stripped of his political mastery and portrayed as a weakling, placating his brother's killers simply because he wishes to avoid war at any cost, whilst the domestic political strife within Dawn itself, so central to the novels, was entirely exercised, with Ilaria and the Sand Snakes straightforwardly murdering Doran and taking over the kingdom before declaring war upon the Lannisters. Quite apart from the melodramatic superficiality of these changes, the true damage done to the show's reputation was that the Sand Snakes became the first protagonists on Game of Thrones completely devoid of character development. Their personalities, such as they are paper-thin, portrayed on the one hand as whiny, brattish adolescents, and on the other as heartless and mind-numbingly generic femme fatales. No serious effort was made to provide any of them with concise backstories, clear motives beyond avenging their father, or even distinctive personalities. All we ever learn about them is that they are 1. Excellent warriors, 2. Childishly competitive with one another, and 3. Callously indifferent to the suffering of others, which makes it impossible to empathise with them despite their heartbreaking bereavement. What makes the Sand Snakes' lack of characterisation all the more disappointing is that their backstories should have provided the show's creators with plenty of fodder for making them seriously nuanced and sympathetic characters, had time been allotted to get to know each of them individually. All 3 are stepsisters, with different mothers, but with the same enormously influential father. Their squabbles, which are depicted as nothing more than immature one-upmanship, who can fight the best, hit the hardest, endure pain the longest, could have been drawn out and integrated into the politics of the Dornish court. Instead, the show simply took 2 of Oberyn's numerous character traits, his love of sex and his talent as a warrior, and made these the sum total of his daughters' personalities, rendering them nothing more than sadistic, sexually driven ciphers. Sadly, the treatment of the Dawn plot would prove less an isolated misstep and more a harbinger of things to come, as showrunners David Benioff and Dan Weiss, from season 5 onwards, desperately sought to tie together the series' numerous storylines, in the process taking an axe to their enormous supporting cast. Hence, Mira Reed, who at great personal cost had spent 3 seasons beyond the wall defending the paraplegic Bran Stark, simply gets Bran back to Winterfell and immediately announces her intention of returning home, never to be seen again. Osha, similarly, charged by Bran with protecting his younger brother Rickon, is reintroduced out of nowhere purely to have her throat slit by Ramsay Bolton. The adorable Shireen Baratheon is burned at the stake as the final step on her father Stannis' road to self-destruction. And, most spectacularly, the long-standing political feud between Lannisters and Tyrells at the royal court is brought to an abrupt conclusion in the season 6 finale when Cersei simply blows up all of her political adversaries in one fell swoop, including the brilliant Marjorie, before claiming the throne for herself. This latter plot development was only made possible because once the Sparrows were introduced, both Marjorie and Olenna were heavily dumbed down by the writers, as the season's plot became less about Lannisters versus Tyrells and more about Lannisters versus Sparrows. Quite simply, Olenna is one of the great minds of the Seven Kingdoms, right up there with Tywin, Tyrion, Littlefinger and Varys, and Marjorie is her protege, essentially a budding Olenna 2.0. Cersei, meanwhile, is exactly what Tywin said of her.
I don't distrust you because you're a woman. I distrust you because you're not as smart as you think you are.
There's no way, if character consistency had been maintained, that Olenna and Marjorie wouldn't have managed to outfox both the Sparrows and Cersei. But the show's writers wanted Cersei to win, so this never happened. This policy of aggressive streamlining more broadly came to affect every one of the series' principal female characters, tragically undoing much of what had made the early seasons of Game of Thrones so great. Brienne was gradually allowed to fade into the background, sent away on various side missions just to keep her character busy, before finally, with no further missions to complete, finding herself relegated to the role of Jaime Lannister's love interest and potential redeemer, her irrelevance underscored by the fact that she is last sighted in the series' final episode, filling in Jaime's unfinished biography in the famous Book of Brothers, inadvertently emphasising the extent to which her story had entirely become an addendum to his. Even more disappointing was the fate of Arya, who journeyed to Braavos to train as an assassin, as the writers sought to resolve her series-long character arc centred around her relationship with death, her thirst for vengeance against her family's killers, and her search for a personal identity with which she was entirely comfortable. Instead of building upon these foundations, however, Arya simply became one of the first Game of Thrones protagonists to receive typical Hollywood plot armour, in a cringeworthy group of scenes entirely at odds with the show's traditional realism, surviving what should have been a fatal knife attack before illogically prevailing over her assailant after sprinting through the city streets and leaping off high-rise buildings, bleeding from her stomach all the while. Worse still, her identity crisis is only superficially resolved, enabling her to return home to Westeros largely unchanged in outlook, but now conveniently armed with a fighting style redolent of a Hong Kong martial arts heroine, allowing her to easily slaughter her family's enemies and even end up being the one to kill the Night King, whom she defeats with little more than a bit of fancy weapons play. By the time the series drew to a close, Arya had devolved from an enormously empathetic child-come-adolescent into a ruthless ninja with unstoppable combat skills and virtually no personality. Providing an equally limp ending, Sansa was transformed, essentially from season 5 onwards, from a protagonist who had actively subverted the ingenue princess model of classical heroine into a cliché battered and broken archetype. In Season 6, in one of the show's last truly great scenes, Sansa reunites with Littlefinger, who had rescued her from King Joffrey in Season 4, only to hand her over to the equally sadistic Ramsay Bolton in Season 5, under whose control she had endured repeated emotional, physical and sexual abuse. In a harrowing articulation of the impact of rape, Sansa coldly confronted Littlefinger with the consequences of his actions.
Would you like to hear about our wedding night? He never hurt my face. He needed my face, the face of Ned Stark's daughter. But the rest of me, he did what he liked with the rest of me. The other things he did, ladies aren't supposed to talk about those things, but I imagine brothel keepers talk about them all the time. I can still feel it. I don't mean in my tender heart, it still pains me so. I can still feel what he did in my body, standing here right now. Go back to Mount Caelan. My brother and I will take back the North on our own. I never want to see you again.
From this defiant articulation of inner strength, however, Sansa, a mere 2 seasons later, was claiming,
Without Littlefinger and Ramsay and the rest, I would have stayed a little bird all my life.
The contrast between these 2 scenes could not be clearer. In her heart-wrenching Season 6 monologue, Sansa eloquently expressed how her strength of character had prevailed in spite of the indignities foisted upon her. By Season 8, she was parroting the ridiculous notion, far too common amongst modern Hollywood screenwriters, that it was the abuse itself that had made her stronger. Worse still, her strength in these later seasons came to be crudely equated with callousness, as if her underlying kindness and empathy, which had come to the fore during Seasons 2 and 3 once her position of privilege had been lost, were weaknesses which needed to be exercised so that she could grow into a woman strong enough to feed Ramsay to his own hounds and oversee Littlefinger's execution, in each case without a flicker of emotion, indeed with barely concealed enjoyment at their grisly fates. Above and beyond each of these examples, however, the most notorious instance of Game of Thrones showrunners streamlining the plot at the expense of their female characters arose with the destruction of Daenerys' female-driven armada, which crossed the Narrow Sea in the Season 6 finale to retake the Iron Throne. Having constructed alliances with all the great Westerosi houses whom the Lannisters have wronged, Daenerys sails for Westeros, supported not only by her own troops, but also with the available manpower of the Tyrells, Greyjoys and Martells at her disposal, and with Olenna Tyrell, Yara Greyjoy, Ellaria Sand and the Sand Snakes acting as members of her inner circle of advisors. So imposing did this armada appear that a few female fans even posited optimistically in online forums between Season 6 and 7 that the final 2 seasons might potentially witness Daenerys redressing the Seven Kingdoms gender politics by ascending the throne and carving out powerful lordships for her female allies, just as she had forcibly ended centuries of institutionalized slavery on Essos. Instead, this female-heavy alliance was obliterated in a matter of 3 episodes. Firstly, by having Jaime Lannister easily defeat the Tyrell army off-screen and force Lady Olenna to commit suicide, and secondly, by having the alliance's 4 warrior women, Yara Greyjoy and the Sand Snakes, together with Ellaria Sand, defeated in the most humiliating circumstances imaginable by Yara's swaggering, piratical uncle Euron, an overtly misogynistic, one-dimensional villain encased in plot armour and introduced late in Season 6 solely to even up the fight for the Iron Throne between Daenerys and Cersei. Euron's lazily written triumph killed off the hated Dawn plot in a single flurry, but much more problematically, it transformed Yara Greyjoy into her uncle's helpless captive for the near duration of the show's run. Indeed, marking out this plot point as one of the worst instances of Game of Thrones succumbing to Hollywood cliché, a character who had always been portrayed as possessing incredible fortitude and pragmatism, and who had been one of the series' proudest warriors and most competent military commanders, was converted into the stereotypical damsel in distress, decisively outmanoeuvred and captured purely so that Theon could rescue her and thus redeem himself in the process. Each of these missteps, however, pales into insignificance when compared with Benioff and Weiss's mishandled treatment of Daenerys and Cersei's battle for the Iron Throne over the show's final 2 seasons. There were, of course, underlying narrative issues at play. Daenerys, with her grand Westerosi alliance and trio of dragons, was so obviously unassailable that poorly conceived plot devices, like those just cited, had to be invented to artificially weaken her position. Cersei, meanwhile, was left to devolve into an utterly one-dimensional villainess. After blowing up her domestic enemies in the Season 6 finale, she spends Seasons 7 and 8 smugly sipping wine on the balcony of the royal palace whilst concocting outlandishly wicked schemes to defeat Daenerys, several of which succeed purely thanks to the plot armour granted Euron and Jaime in order to elongate the struggle for the throne. Yet, beyond even these structural shortcomings, the far greater problem was the characterisation of Daenerys herself as the series reached its climax. At the heart of her deterioration rested the questionable premise, introduced in the very first volume of George R.R. Martin's novels, that due to their centuries of inbreeding, whenever a Targaryen is born, the gods flip a coin, rendering them either stalwart and true heroes/heroines or mad tyrants. As a consequence, there was always a sense, in both the novels and HBO's adaptation, that Daenerys was potentially doomed by this fanciful genetic imperative to follow in her late father's footsteps and become the Mad Queen. The catastrophe for her character arc was that her showrunners clearly decided that mad she would be, despite the fact that her actions thus far placed her squarely in the heroic Targaryen mould. Hence, in order to arbitrarily portray her as a budding villain, Daenerys' actions as a ruler were persistently held to an unrealistically higher standard than any of her male counterparts. Daenerys had always been a benevolent and optimistic character. She articulates this herself in Season 5, informing Tyrion that she intends to break the wheel, that is, make the world a better place by force if necessary. Even in the first season, she actively steps in against cultural precedent to prevent the Dothraki from raping their captives. In Season 3, having acquired an army of unsullied slave soldiers, rather than simply crossing the narrow sea to reclaim the Iron Throne, she instead sets them free, convinces them to fight for her without chains, and undertakes a lengthy detour, moving from one slave city to the next, liberating the oppressed and significantly enhancing her loyal following.
We don't need Yunkai, Khaleesi.
How many slaves are there in Yunkai?
200,000, if not more.
Then we have 200,000 reasons to take the city.
She subsequently discovers, to her dismay, that conquering and ruling require very different skill sets, and she intermittently makes unwise decisions and struggles to discern what to do next. But in the context of her story arc, these mistakes serve to reinforce her status as a multi-layered character, politically inexperienced but feeling her way, rather than simply implying that she is a fundamentally poor ruler. Indeed, reinforcing her idealism and innate goodness, when she and Yara Greyjoy broker their alliance at the end of Season 6, Daenerys openly acknowledges that both of their fathers were terrible rulers and evil men, before powerfully expressing her bold vision for the future of Westeros.
They left the world worse than they found it. We're not going to do that.
We're going to leave the world better than we found it.
None of this is the behaviour of a genetically predetermined Mad Queen, destined to gleefully roast the poverty-stricken residents of King's Landing with dragonfire for no reason whatsoever. In fact, Daenerys only does so near the end of the series in order to retroactively validate the unfounded claims made by the men around her that they can perceive hints of her tyrannical father in her behaviour. And here is where good old-fashioned Hollywood sexism rears its ugly head on two counts. Firstly, Daenerys becomes the victim of flagrant double standards. The series is full of instances of just and honourable male heroes executing those who deserve it. Robb Stark, for example, beheads one of his leading commanders, Lord Karstark, for butchering two teenage Lannister boys he was holding in honourable captivity, whilst Jon Snow, in his capacity as Lord Commander of the Night's Watch, hangs a boy younger than his baby brother Bran, and takes the head of a comrade, Janos Slynt, who willfully disobeys his orders, ignoring the latter's pleas for mercy as he strikes the fatal blow. Yet, whilst these actions are portrayed, certainly in Robb's case, as strategically short-sighted, there is no question that by the moral standards of Game of Thrones' medieval setting, they were anything but just, and they in no way undermine Robb or Jon's honourable reputations. In stark contrast, when Daenerys exercises precisely the same type of rough justice upon Randall and Dickon Tarly for refusing to bend the knee, and much earlier in near identical circumstances to Robb upon one of her own liberated slaves, Mosador, her advisers watch on with wary concern, as if witnessing the earliest warning signs that she may become the Mad Queen after all. Secondly, and even more damagingly, Benioff and Weiss permit Daenerys' chief advisers, Tyrion and Varys, to openly discuss, in all seriousness, whether having a cock is necessary for a good ruler, essentially insinuating that Daenerys and Cersei, as women, are far too shrill, cruel, emotional and impulsive to calmly and efficiently run a kingdom. Moreover, Daenerys and Cersei's ambition to sit upon the Iron Throne is itself portrayed as a sign that they are unfit to rule, as the series adopts the poorly conceived notion that the best possible ruler is someone with no such ambition. Ignoring the fact that Ned Stark perfectly fitted this bill, yet, after a bare few days as regent, inadvertently set the wheels in motion that would lead to a bloody civil war. In essence, as Game of Thrones' writing deteriorated and fell back upon the clichés of traditional Hollywood storytelling, the show's female protagonists systematically succumbed to the overused, moralistic tropes that have been holding back female characters on screen since the classical studio era of the early to mid-20th century. Brienne devolved from an impressively nuanced character in her own right into Jaime Lannister's love interest and potential redeemer, the woman as domesticator seeking to make Jaime a better person. Sansa succumbed to the battered and broken archetype, believing the repeated abuse she had suffered had straightforwardly moulded her character. Arya, at the opposite extreme, became a superficially strong warrior woman, full of unrealistically impressive fight choreography and precious little personality to back it up. Yara Greyjoy was relegated to the role of helpless damsel in distress, purely to forward her brother Theon's character arc. Cersei became little more than a cardboard cutout monologuing villainess. And perhaps worst of all, Daenerys was transformed from a complex protagonist, entirely worthy of sitting upon the Iron Throne, into a walking, talking exemplar of why women are supposedly too emotional and irrational to be placed in positions of real authority. Through this series of missteps, a show renowned for its subtle portrayal of its female characters ended up surrendering to the well-worn stereotypes of traditional Hollywood storytelling. If you enjoyed this content, I'd recommend checking out my new book, Hollywood's Women of Action, From the Perils of Pauline to Wonder Woman, which examines the development of the action heroine as a character from the silent screen era to the present day. It's available from Amazon and other international booksellers. To purchase, follow the link in the description below. And if you enjoyed this video, please don't forget to like, comment and subscribe.